everyone the trouble. And there's narcissism in that too, because they know their names are going to be splashed across the page. That's their notoriety instead of their accomplishment. And of course, the media is unbelievably complicit in that. So when you're talking about motivation for evil, then you have to understand what it is that's driving it. And it is a deep resentment about the structure of being, for being saturated with suffering, but also for rejecting your sacrifices, and that that produces the bitterness of failure. And I'll stop with this. One of the things that's really interesting about the Old Testament is that, and the Jews in the Old Testament, is that they don't take the path of Cain. Every time they're walloped by God, which is like fairly frequently, they say, we must have done something wrong and we have to set ourselves right. And that's an unbelievably heroic attitude, because that's the alternative to cursing fate. It's like you take the responsibility for failure onto yourself, and you think, well, if I just had my act together a little bit more, if I took advantage of every opportunity that was put in front of me, if I wasn't resentful and bitter, then I could have done something that would have tilted the situation in a different direction. And that's almost inevitably true.
Well, it's interesting. And again, this is kind of where, when I would hear you say things like that. So as you know, I wrote a book called Extreme Ownership. The opening chapter of the book is a horrible situation with a fratricide happens on the battlefield. So friendly forces killing friendly forces, some of those forces being mine. And, it's all these people I could blame and all these little incidents that happened that I could have said, well, we had this radio cryptographic change that happened in the middle of operation, and it had people who weren't able to talk to each other, and we had these Iraqis that we didn't speak English, and we had these units that we hadn't worked with before, and they did things that we didn't expect, and there's plenty of blame to go around. And essentially I said, hey, you know whose fault this is? This is my fault. I'm the commander. And so when I hear you say things like that, it strikes me that you uncovered this through your study of history and philosophy and religion. And I learned it, as, like I said, a certified knuckle dragger out on the battlefield that realized, if you're going to exist as a leader and as a human, then you need to take responsibility for what happens around you. And that's, again,
you have to take, the religious notion in some sense is that you have to take ultimate responsibility, in that, in some sense, the things that happen around you. I mean, this is, Dostoevsky, I think, said something like, every man is responsible for everything that happens to him and everything that happens to everyone else. And that's, it's a crazy statement, right? It's a crazy statement. And he was a pretty extreme person in many, many ways. But there's a level at which that's metaphysically true, because what happens is that it's failure to act often that's the most catastrophic. It's to not do the right thing when the situation presents itself, and it's very specific. You're constantly in situations where you could do the right thing if you were willing to take a risk that's actually of relatively moderate size, and that you could take the risk, and that you should take the risk, and you don't. And that happens to people all the time. And then what happens is the thing that they didn't oppose grows a little bit, and they shrink a little bit, and that starts a loop, hey? And you say, well, how do you take responsibility for the world? And the answer is, well, you also have to do it with a certain degree of humility, because what do you know? And this is part of the reason that I'm so opposed to the activist culture on college campuses. You don't teach 18-year-olds to go and demonstrate about capitalism, because they don't know anything, and they have problems in their own life that need to be solved that are local. And the local problems aren't trivial, they're not disciplined. They're not looking at the world in a straight way. They're not taking responsibility for themselves or for their actions, their sexual actions, among others. They're not taking responsibility for their family. They're not looking at how they could contribute to the community. They don't understand the fact that they don't know anything. And so they should be taught to start locally and to put things together that they could put together, to make their bed and to clean up their room and to attend their classes with regularity if they're going to university, because that's part of the implicit contract. and to straighten up the things around them that are actually within their power to straighten up. And then what happens is that if you do that, let's say religiously, which I suppose would be the same as in a disciplined manner, that your realm of influence starts to grow, but it grows in a positive way. Just like you can end up in hell one step at a time, and that's extraordinarily well documented. You can end up at the opposite place of that one step at a time, but it's also that same gradual process. You don't get to leap from being a 17-year-old knothead who doesn't know anything and who isn't disciplined to the critic of Judeo-Christian society. You just don't know enough to do that, especially when you can look at your own life and think about how many things that you're doing that you know are wrong, that you could fix, that you aren't fixing. And that's the crucial thing. This mode of thinking isn't asking people to stretch themselves beyond what they're capable of. It's just asking them to stretch themselves to the point that they are capable of and seeing what happens. And that works. It works. I've had many people write me over the last year, and this is a great thing, really, it's a great thing, who said that they started to tell the truth, or at least not to lie, because who can tell the truth, right? But at least you can not lie. And that they started to put things in order around them that they could put in order, and that, the positive things just started to happen like mad. And they're not nihilistic, and they've got a purpose in their life. And so, thank God for that. And it does work. So,
I was trying to think of how to stop the loop of my sacrifices have been rejected. And the way that you stop that loop is, instead of saying my sacrifices were rejected, so my hard work, my effort, everything that I'm doing to try and move forward, it's not working. And if you want to go towards hell, you keep saying, well, it's not working, but it's because of everyone else. They're rejecting me. They're not accepting what I've done. Whereas if you say to yourself, oh, it didn't work, okay, it's my fault. What can I do better? And that's how you start moving in the other direction, which is...
Yeah, well, at least you have control. And, you don't even necessarily have to think it's your fault, although that's a reasonable way of looking at it. You could minimally just accept the fact that it's your responsibility. You're stuck with it, and you could actually change it. And once you know, too, that if you're failing repeatedly, then there's probably something wrong. It's possible that there's something wrong with the way that you're conceptualizing the world, because you have a choice, right? If you keep making sacrifices and they don't work, there's a binary choice, and one is, well, there's something wrong with the structure of reality, and the other is there's something wrong with your approach. And so then you might say, well, let's take the first idea, there's something wrong with the structure of reality. It's like, you're really going to say that, are you? You're really going to come out and say, I know enough to judge the nature of being? And then the alternative is also quite frightening, because then, it's you that's making the mistakes, and you might be wrong at a really deep level, and that might mean that a lot of you has to burn off and be transformed. Maybe even things about yourself that you think are admirable and that you like, because your position, your self-conceptualization is so warped and wrong. And that's really daunting. But, when people set themselves up as the judge of being, I've written about this a fair bit in my new book, which is called 12 Rules for Life. When people set themselves up as the judge of being, then they take on what can only be described as a kind of satanic arrogance, because they've actually taken to themselves the moral you're doing is stating your cowardice and your historical ignorance, because if you're going to be Minister of Foreign Affairs, you bloody well better have imagination for that kind of evil, because if you don't, then anyone who does wins. They beat you. And so and again, in the Harry Potter stories, you see he's touched by evil, right? He actually has a soul fragment that's embedded within him that's as black as anything can possibly be. That's why he could talk to snakes. But without that, he wouldn't be able to have any victory. And that's exactly right psychologically. Unless you can think the way that an evil person thinks, then you're defenseless against them, because they'll go places you can't imagine, and then they win. And so the best men I've met, it was interesting even when I was in junior high and high school, because most of my friends dropped out, by the time they were grade 10, thereabouts. And a lot of them were guys who developed physically, they're pretty powerful, and they were just damn sick of putting up their hand to go to the bathroom. It's like, they're not doing that anymore. One of my friends got kicked out when he sort of challenged the gym teacher. physically. And the gym teacher, he could do an iron cross. He was a tough guy, and so it was no trivial matter for my friend to stand up to him, but he got expelled anyways. But, I noticed that it was often the kids whose character I admired that either quit or got expelled, and they were the tougher guys who were just sick and tired of following rules that didn't take into account their character, and then they'd go off and work in the oil rigs or whatever. And you could do that in Alberta at that time. That was really hard work, so it wasn't like they were necessarily taking the easy path. But like, a harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very, very dangerous man who has that under voluntary control. And you also see that like one of the central female stories, let's say, if the hero archetype is the central male story, there are variants of hero archetypes that are relevant to women, and one of them is Beauty and the Beast. And Beauty isn't interested in the guy who isn't the beast. She's interested in the guy who's the beast, and that's exactly right, but she's interested in the guy who's the beast that can be civilized and disciplined, right, and who can use that in the service, well, let's say, of a family. And that's exactly how it should be.
So I gave a speech, one of my very good friends got married a few years ago, and I gave a speech. And at this speech, he was a frontline SEAL, and at this speech, I was talking about what it was to be a man, and when I felt like I was a man. And I said there was three things that I felt let me transition from being, mentally insecure about who I was as a person to being, okay, I'm actually good with who I am. Number one was learning how to fight. Mm-hmm. And, I got into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and mixed martial arts, and I learned how to fight. And now, all of a sudden, when I looked at other people, I wasn't posturing, I wasn't trying to pretend that I was tough. I knew that most people that I would encounter, I could defeat in a physical altercation. That was number one. Number two is going into combat. Because even though you might be tough in a street fight or in a fist fight with someone, when you're facing death, well, that's a whole nother level. And for me, going into combat, well, what was I going to act like? Was I going to be scared? Was I going to be a coward? Was I going to be scared of death? And when I went into combat, I wasn't. I was fine. I was okay with the fact that I could die, and I was okay with that. And I made good decisions and did what I was supposed to do. And the last one was I got married and had kids. Because all of a sudden, all these things, these being aggressive and working to fight and be able to destroy in an efficient way, well, then I took that and combined it with, okay, now I'm going to take care of my wife and our children, and that's what I'm going to do. And my point in giving this speech was he was a guy that had learned how to fight. He was a guy that had been in combat, and now there was one more step to take, which was, okay, now you're going to get married and you're going to take care of these people. So it's interesting that once again, that dichotomy that you talk about, it fits perfectly into the way I find it. And here's a good example. When I first got in the SEAL teams, there's no war going on. So what did a good SEAL do? You know what you did? You went out and drank and got in bar fights. Mm-hmm. That's what a good SEAL did. So you know what I did? Went out and drank, got in bar fights. That's what I'm supposed to do. It took me a while to figure out, no, there's actually something more than that. Like, we're actually supposed to be preparing for war. And so now, like you said, I definitely acted things out and sort of was on a decent path, but as I got older and more mature, and to this day, as I can look around and actually overlay the understanding on the way I've carried out my life, it's very helpful to me, and it also helps me explain it to other people that see the path that I'm on, go, they like that path. They would like to join me on that path. And I get guys that, when I was in, I look like a serial killer for all practical purposes. That's the way I come across, right?
Not creepy enough.
There's guys that would, guys that would work for me or guys that would be around me, and they'd see me and they'd kind of latch on to the fact that I was tough and aggressive. And some of those guys, they wouldn't catch the other part, which was that I was politically savvy and I was working and I was maneuvering and I was, figuring things out and talking to my boss in such a way that we could get where we needed to be. And I was doing that whole other side. And so I get these guys that would end up not doing as well as they should do because they were just, hey, Jocko's just ultra aggressive and he gets after it, and so that's what I'm going to do, and I'll be in the same place. The guys that would do well were the guys that said, oh yeah, Jocko's awesome and he's aggressive and he gets after it. He's also working and he's also maneuvering and he's also massaging the egos of the people around him to make sure that they get positioned in the right spot where they can go to war in the right way. And so as I've gotten older, I've been able to tell people that more clearly. Like, hey, it's not just about that side of the ultra aggressive. You got to be aggressive. You got to be willing to fight. You got to be willing to kill, and you got to be willing to die.
But your child can do things that you don't like, and that you will take it out on them if you don't straighten it out. And people don't like that idea because they think, well, I'd never do anything. You know, I love my child. I'd never do anything to hurt them. It's like, yeah, God, right. You know, you're so asleep if you think that there's almost no hope for you. You have to think, I'm way bigger than this child, and I'm way meaner, and I'm way trickier, and I'm way more unpredictable. And so I better be very careful in my relationships with this child so that the worst of me doesn't come out. And then that gives you enough intelligence to make a disciplinary framework that's minimal and enforce it properly and carefully. And then you can have an unbelievably good relationship with your kids. So,
and this idea of discipline, obviously, I talk about discipline a lot. And one of the things you were talking about earlier with regards to veterans and people that have listened to your lectures, and it's the same thing with me, people that listen to this podcast or read the books. And one of the things that I've noticed and I've talked about and I've gotten a lot of positive feedback on is, you know, when you're in the military, you have this discipline. And beyond the discipline that's imposed on you, you also have a lot that you have to just hold the line yourself. I mean, when you're in the military, sure, you go through boot camp where there's a drill instructor that you do and all that, but once you're in the military, you're doing what you have to do. It's self-discipline, that you learn that and you become self-disciplined. And what happens is guys get out and that's gone, and that hurts them. And the other thing that hurts them is they don't know what their mission is anymore. Mm-hmm. And my big thing with people that I've been telling vets now is find what your next mission is. Go find whatever your next mission is. I don't care what it is, but it has to be something. And I was listening to you talk on something the other day, and you were talking about how not doing anything, when people are not going anywhere, when they're failing, when they don't have the drive, it's because they're not accepting responsibility for anything. And so my way of saying that is like, you need a new mission. You need to be responsible for something, and you need to go and move towards some new mission. And do you encounter people that, or you see people, that's very problematic in the civilian side as well, where people, they just don't know what they're doing.
Yeah,
they're not taking responsibility for anything.
That's part of this nihilism, you know, is that because first of all, you learn that truth is relative, and that there's no real moral order. And, you know, that alleviates you of responsibility. And that's why that's such an attractive message to people. But the problem is that it kills you. It kills your soul, so to speak, because, well, we can talk about this technically. So, you know, there are systems, neurological systems that underlie your experience of negative emotion, and there are neurological systems that underlie your experience of positive emotion, and they're separate systems. They obviously interact, but they're separate systems. So, but the positive emotion system, well, there's two of them, but one of them sort of kicks in when you get something that you want. So, you know, you're hungry and you eat, and that feels good. And so that's kind of the simple one. But there's a more sophisticated one that I think is even more active in people. And it's the one that tells you that you're moving forward towards something worthwhile. And that's actually the one that gives people that sense of meaningful engagement in their life, also doing whatever was necessary to prolong your miserable existence, that he started to think about that deeply, and that he went over his life with a fine-tooth comb and tried to figure out everything he did that he knew was wrong, and then to try to figure out what he could do in the present to rectify that. You know, you wouldn't necessarily be able to atone. That's the right way of thinking about it. You know, you do something wrong, and well, maybe you can't even fix it with the person you did the wrong to, but maybe there's something else you could do that would be good enough so that, you know, you can think, okay, well, at least those balance out, and maybe I'm a little bit on the side of the positive. So he did that, you know, and that he said that straightened him out a lot. And then he wrote this book, this amazing book that cut the communist intellectuals off at their knees and change the world, really. And that's a hell of a thing for someone to do who's a miserable Zek in a concentration camp. That's a hell of a story, man, and it's not the only one like it. So you don't know how much power you have where you stand, even if you look weak, and if what's around you is terrible, well, then you've got lots of things to do, that's for sure, and they're announcing themselves right there. So, and it's tying it in with evil and suffering that is best for me, because it's so real. It's like you can be skeptical about the existence of the good, but if you open your eyes and you do any amount of studying and even any amount of self-examination, you can't be skeptical about the existence of evil. I don't believe that you can. There are things that, read about Unit 731 and then see how skeptical you are about evil. I wouldn't recommend that, by the way, because that is so horrible that you can't really read it without being traumatized. It is unbelievably horrible. You read that, and then you say, well, morality is relative. It's like, see if you can utter those words after reading that. And then if morality isn't relative and there is evil, then there is good. It's at least whatever isn't evil, right? Whatever doesn't cause that is good. It's sort of defining it by its opposite, but that's okay. Doesn't matter, it's good enough.
And so how do guys, going back to the PTSD conversation a little bit, how many guys that sort of experience this evil part of not only of the world but of themselves, because they had to do some things that they didn't want to do or they didn't like doing, and things that made them feel